Friends, shalom. I greet all of you and glad you. Let me know how the picture and sound are. Shalom, and I wish you a wonderful mood. Today we have a wonderful lesson. As you've already guessed, today we're talking about the Didache. Most people don't even know what that is. They've never heard of it, and that's a shame. It's a shame that you haven't heard about the Didache and don't know what it's actually about. After all, the Didache is a very important document for us to study and understand what was happening in those times. So, before we move on to the main lesson, I'd like to give a bit of historical background. You can read about the Didache on Wikipedia, or you can find information about the Didache on the internet. There's a huge amount of information out there. There's a huge amount of information, but the understanding of what's actually written there is almost non-existent. In fact, the Didache isn't studied in any Bible schools at all. That's how it is. It kind of gets distanced from the Christian world because the Didache is a very Jewish work. That's how it is. But for us, it's very important, extremely important. So let's move on to this illustration here. So the Didache, or the so-called teaching of the 12 apostles. Today we'll talk about its historical background and discuss its components. Angelica, thank you. Thank you. Today we'll talk about why this document is important to us. After all, we're in the transitional period of the second generation. For a long time, the Didache was considered lost. Its existence was only known from mentions by the early church fathers. For example, Eusebius of Caesarea in the 4th century mentioned the so-called teachings of the apostles in the list of disputed, but not heretical books, not yet heretical, let's say, in the 4th century. Athanasius the Great, also from the 4th century, likewise mentioned it as a book for catechumens preparing for baptism, not included in the canon, but useful for reading. Notice that the Didache was not included in the canon, and it was left out for some very interesting reasons. For almost 1500 years, researchers did not have the complete text in their hands. Then, in 1873, the Greek Orthodox Metropolitan Philotheos Bryennios discovered the full Greek text of the Didache in the library of the Metochion at the Jerusalem Patriarchate's representation in Istanbul in Constantinople. The text was part of a manuscript collection known as the Jerusalem Codex. The codex itself is dated to the year 1056 AD. So, essentially, what we have as the Didache comes from the year 1056 AD. However, according to scholars, the text of the Didache contained in the codex is much older. Most researchers date its composition to the end of the 1st or the beginning of the 2nd century. That is approximately the years 70 to 120. This is exactly the period we are studying today, and the one we are currently in. This makes the Didache a contemporary of some of the later books of the New Testament, such as the Gospel of John, and one of the oldest Christian texts outside the Bible. So, the authenticity of things. After Philotheos published the text in 1883, the authenticity of the Didache was immediately recognized by the scholarly community. What arguments do we have for the authenticity of the Didache? Its language, theology, and the liturgical practices described are very ancient and primitive in nature, and they perfectly match the realities of early Christian communities before their more complex hierarchical development. That is, before the hierarchical structure that emerged by the year 325, communities lived according to what is called the Didache mindset. Later, small fragments of the Didache were found in Coptic or Latin, which confirms its wide circulation in the early church. Today, the Didache is considered authentic and an invaluable window into the life of one of the early Christian communities. Again, we do not have the original of the Didache. No one knows who the authors of the Didache were. It is believed to be a kind of collective work created jointly by several communities. That is, whether it was done in Syria or somewhere else. The Didache is a practical guide. The purpose of the Didache is to provide instructions on the key aspects of community life. First and foremost, moral instructions, rules for baptism, fasting, Eucharistic prayers, guidelines on how to receive wandering prophets, and how to organize the hierarchy, that is, how to choose leaders. So, the Didache can't really be attributed to a specific person, like, say, one of Paul's letters. Instead, it's more generally connected to the early Christian community as a whole, which tried to record its principles and traditions in this document. One of the most important aspects of the Didache that points to its antiquity is its Christology, that is, its teaching about Christ. In the Didache, this is at a very early stage of development, even before the complex dogmas of the ecumenical councils were formulated. And in the texts of the Didache, Jesus is never directly called God. Instead, very significant titles are used to describe him, such as pious, which means servant or child. In the Eucharistic prayers, in chapters 9 and 10, the Greek word pious is used to refer to Jesus. This word has two main meanings, son or child, and servant. That's it. This is clearly seen in the context of the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah writes an entire song. Isaiah chapter 42, chapter 49, chapter 50, chapter 52, chapter 53. There we constantly encounter such terms as servant of the Lord, or servant, or branch, or child. He clears his throat. Didache chapter 9, verse 2 says, "We thank you, our Father, for the holy vine of David, your servant, which you made known to us through Yeshua, your servant." So here we see how Yeshua is placed on the same level as King David, as another great servant of God. Also, in the Didache, chapter 10, verse 2, it says, "We thank you, Holy Father, for your holy name." That is, this is an address to the Creator, and for the vision and faith in immortality, which you have revealed to us through Yeshua, your servant. That's exactly how it's written. Later on, the Church Fathers considered this to be a low Christology. This was still before the development of later concepts like high Christology, where Yeshua is already called God and so on and so forth. We can see that the Didache is deeply rooted in the Jewish tradition, because this very view of Yeshua was grounded in Jewish monotheism and Messianic expectations. In other words, the author of the Didache, or the communities that used the Didache, were already thinking in Jewish categories. That is, there is one God, and there is his servant Messiah, through whom salvation and knowledge come. A similar Christology can be found in Acts of the Apostles 3:13 and 3:26. In the synodal text, he is called Son there. But if you look at the Greek language, the same word servant is used there. Of course, in the Didache, there are no concepts like the Trinity, consubstantial Son of God, God-man, or man-God. All these things come much later, and we will talk about them. They appear in theological debates only in the 3rd and 4th centuries. So, in the Didache, the Messiah is presented to us as the perfect servant of the Lord who fulfilled the prophecy. And for us, this is important. This understanding is important for us. So, my friends, Now, we will smoothly transition and move on to our main lesson after I have basically given you a comprehensive historical overview of the subject matter. So, welcome everyone to the 10th lesson of our course. And today we're talking about a time capsule. Just imagine now, after what you've heard, imagine that you found the manual for a device written right after the brilliant inventor had left. A manual that shows how the first followers tried to preserve the legacy when the master himself was no longer around. This very document is the Didache, the so-called teaching of the 12 apostles. It is the earliest set of church rules that has come down to us. Again, the complete Didache, that is already from the year 1000 something. And earlier mentions of the Didache refer to the early church. We have some fragments which you can see on the screen, and they are also dated to around the year 400. So we don't have the originals, basically just small pieces. And we also don't know the authorship. But in any case, we have the knowledge, and that's already a lot. That's it. Basically, this is the earliest church rulebook that has come down to us. Today, we're not just going to study it, we'll understand how it demonstrates the grand shift, essentially from the vibrant, charismatic movement of the first apostles to an organized religion. So, when we look at the Acts of the Apostles, it's like a living river. People are being healed, there's movement, everything is happening. Here, we no longer see all of that. Here, we see a straightforward organization. And then we'll see when this early practical charter was transformed under the influence of Greek philosophy, which essentially changed Christianity forever. So, let's set off on our journey to the end of the 1st century, our course after the flame. Let's go. So, the survival charter, that's what I call it. Let's dive into the context. The year 70, the temple is destroyed. The Jewish people are in shock and scattered. There are hardly any apostles, witnesses of Yeshua, left alive. Communities of believers are scattered throughout the Roman Empire, from Antioch to Alexandria. Anti-Semitism is off the charts in all the Greek provinces. Greek bishops are practically running all the processes. Practical questions arise. How to accept new members, how to pray together so that it is a unified prayer. How, for example, do you tell a true teacher from a fraud who just wants to profit from hospitality? The Didache provides answers to these questions. By the way, today I would recommend that pastors read the Didache from time to time. It contains very sensible things. The Didache is not a theological treatise. It's a charter more like a survival manual, a kind of constitution. You could even call the Didache the Christian halakha. So let's look at the key functions. First of all, the moral code. The first 6 chapters are about the teaching of the 2 ways, the way of life and the way of death. This isn't just a lecture on ethics. It was, in fact, your entry ticket into the community. In other words, before you were immersed, dipped, or baptized, you had to study these rules and prove that you were ready to live by them. What rules? Love God. Love your neighbor. Do not kill or steal. Bless those who curse you, like a passport to the kingdom. Without it, entry to community was forbidden. Also, the liturgical order. A certain standardization appears. Just listen to how precisely the text is quoted. It says, baptize in living water. If there is no living water, baptize in other water. If you can't in cold, then in warm. If neither is available, pour water on the head 3 times in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Ha! Now we understand where the phrase living water comes from. Living water is the water of the universe, meaning either rainwater or something similar. In other words, it's practically the same as how mikvahs were made. There was not yet a baptismal service. I think that's what this is about. And the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are mentioned here not as three coessential and distinct deities, but as a reference to three forces. There's no ambiguity. It's the same with the Eucharist. Specific prayer texts are given. Why is this being done? So that a believer from Ephesus coming to a community in Rome would attend the same kind of gathering and feel at home. This created a certain unity among the scattered communities of the empire. But in reality, there was never true unity because there were different paths, different communities. Both practice and history show us two competing schools, the Alexandrian and the Antiochian. Today we are studying the Didache. It's also an administrative charter to maintain order. Just imagine how many wandering preachers there were at that time. The Didache provides a clear text for authenticity. It is quoted as follows: "If the one who comes teaches, and teaches to increase truth and knowledge of the Lord, receive him as the Lord. But if he stays for 3 days, he is a false prophet. When he leaves, let him take nothing except bread. But if he asks for money, he is a false prophet." Beautiful. Harsh but effective. Moreover, the text prescribes, "Ordain for yourselves bishops and deacons who are worthy of the Lord." This is already the birth of elected local authority, which comes to replace the direct apostolic authority that existed in the Acts of the Apostles. This is no longer the world of the apostles. We need to understand that. This is no longer the world of the book of Acts. It's a completely different era. This is already the era of the church. In the era of the apostles, authority was charismatic. There was Peter, there was Paul. Their word was law, there was James. In the era of the Didache, these people are no longer there. There are no longer personalities of that level. That's why rules are needed to check anyone who calls themselves a prophet. In the era of the apostles, everyone lived in anticipation of Yeshua's imminent return. They all practically lived for this: the return of Yeshua, the restoration of Israel, the return of the 12 tribes. All of it, everything, everything, everything. After the year 70, in the second generation, the people who remained already understood that we are here for the long haul. You need to build a stable life, not live in a temporary tent waiting for the apocalypse. In the Acts of the Apostles, believers go to the temple. Paul went to the temple. Peter went to the temple at the 9th hour of prayer. Yeshua went, James too. They were inseparably connected with Israel, the temple, with Judaism. In the Didache, the community is already clearly separated. In the Didache, they even gather on the Lord's Day, that is, on Sunday, not on Shabbat. And they fast on Wednesday and Friday, in contrast to the Jewish tradition. I don't know to what extent the Didache corresponds to the path of the Nazorians who remained, the Jews, or the Ebionites who also existed at that time. We're just studying some documents with you in order to understand the background of what was happening. The problem of the Didache was this: how to organize a church from among the nations to protect it from chaos. And basically, this was the fundamental shift in psychology and goals. And yet, it would certainly seem here it truly is the absolutely ideal charter, remarkably simple, eminently practical, and easily understandable. But history took a different path. The name of that path is Hellenism. The Didache is a text with Jewish thinking. It asks the question how. That is, how to live, how to pray, how to act. This is a kind of halakha, practical rules for the life of the community itself. But Greek philosophy, the language spoken throughout the empire, asked different questions. What and why? And when the church emerged from the underground into the public arena, it had to speak precisely in that language. In other words, not how and what, but why. Look at the gap here. The Didache says how to baptize. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. That's it, period. Nothing else is up for discussion. Greek theology of the 4th century, for example, in Athanasius the Great, asks, but what is the Son? What is his nature? Is he of one essence with the Father? This is already a completely different level of discussion. So, in principle, that's how the great transformation happened, which we call distortion. First of all, the focus shifted from light action to right doctrine, from orthopraxy to orthodoxy. Basically, the first believers, even the second and, generally, the third generation, didn't have major problems with theology. They didn't have New Testament texts, there was no New Testament canon, there were no New Testament books. There were some scattered letters, which were canonized much later. Their only authority was the Tanakh itself, the Jewish practice. But even back then, since the synagogue had separated from them and distanced itself, they were charting their own independent course. Nevertheless, for the Didache, a Christian is simply someone who follows the way of life, and that's it. For a 4th century theologian like Justin Martyr, a Christian is someone who believes correctly and can philosophically justify it. That's why, in later Christianity, everything is built on which doctrines you stand by and which dogmas you profess. In the communities of the 1st century, this question was not raised. The question was only raised in the context of, how do you live? How do you live? Secondly, the simple rule of life, a simple way of living, was replaced by complex creeds. The goal was no longer just to live by the commandments, but to counter heresies using a refined philosophical apparatus. That's why very deep philosophical knowledge, teachings, and creeds were developed, which were not based on life itself, but on how to fight heresies. As if there were fewer heresies, or as if heresies had decreased. Or, what we call departing from the majority is always considered heresy, and so on. This didn't happen out of malice. It was a way to survive. To speak with educated pagans, you had to speak the language of Plato. To argue with the Gnostics, you had to be an even better philosopher than the Gnostics themselves. But as a result, this almost warm and simple rule of the Didache ended up on the shelf of history. It turned out to be too Jewish and too primitive. It was replaced by a complex, systematic philosophical theology which we still can't fully understand to this day. In the Didache, there are no words about the Trinity, no deep explanations of divinity, and so on and so forth. It simply wasn't necessary. Everyone clearly understood who the Creator was and who the Messiah was. That wasn't the problem. The real problem was how to live, how to organize a community in such a way that it could continue to exist and survive. But the communities were scattered all over, the entire Roman Empire, in fact. And different paths, different branches, had their own Didache. But we don't have, so to speak, any other materials or any other knowledge except for what is available to us. So, what is the Didache? It's kind of like a snapshot of a lost world. It's a bridge that remains in our knowledge. On one end, it stands firmly on solid ground, the ground of Jewish ethics and practicality, and on the other end, it already stretches across to the shore of a new community, the Church, with its own rules and its own rhythm of life. It shows us Christianity before it became a religion of complex dogmas. That's why the Didache needs to be studied. I recommend you read it, and it's available online. It's freely accessible. But I can't give you any guarantees. What's on the internet may not necessarily be the actual texts recorded in the Didache. There you go. In general, we have very few guarantees when it comes to texts. But just out of interest, I suggest you read about the practical aspects of the lives of those Christians. Ahem. That's why the Didache and the later history of the Church give completely different answers to this question. And that, perhaps, is the main lesson for us today. We are studying the history of this path together in order to understand the full meaning of what's happening. We are studying this life together, the life that spanned from the year 70 to 325, during which the entire system of both Judaism and Christianity was developing. But while Judaism by that particular time was already an established and well-defined path, it had already taken a clear shape and was simply evolving further. So to speak, Christianity had not yet fully formed. It was still diligently piecing itself together and meticulously organizing itself over the subsequent centuries. Whether it assembled itself correctly and whether it organized itself properly is something that only history can show. If everything the Church did while assembling itself had brought life, awakening, knowledge of the Creator, and a fundamental transformation of the planet into this world, we could probably say that this formation was correct. But when we look at all this from a historical perspective, after 2,000 years have passed, we realize how many flaws, distortions, mistakes, and outright falsifications have been made. We will study all these things together. The victims of these terrible political decisions, of all sorts of political doctrines, and I specifically say political doctrines, not even spiritual ones, were the Jews themselves, as well as the very communities that tried to survive but were ultimately labeled as heretics. And Nazarene beliefs were labeled as heretical, and the Ebionites were also labeled as heretics, as well as various other forms that we will discuss, which were also rejected. They were branded as heretics and cast out beyond the walls. Finding themselves caught between a rock and a hard place, they practically ceased to exist. The world was built solely on the principle of black and white. There were no shades of gray in the world, and there were no half shadows either. The world was built in such a way that if you're not with us, you're against us. No one had the right to a different point of view. The synagogue also established its own canon, created its own charter, and set its own rules. In defending and protecting itself, it clearly defined who was an insider and who was an outsider. These were times of survival. The Jews were trying to survive in this world after the destruction of the temple. Ahem. And we will also study the subsequent uprisings together. After all, besides the year 70, there was also the European uprising. There was a Jewish uprising throughout the Greco-Roman Empire, and it was brutally suppressed. Then we also have the Bar Kokhba revolt in Rabbi Akiva in the year 135, which was not just brutally suppressed, it was, in fact, a real genocide of the Jews. We will study all these issues together. And by that time, a very clear practice had formed in Judaism about who was considered an insider and who was an outsider. Anyone who didn't fit into these boundaries was immediately pushed aside and cut off. Is that right? I think, for that time, it was all correct. Today, there are many, many different movements within Judaism. For example, there is Reform Judaism. If Reform Judaism had existed back then, it would have been pushed aside and labeled heretical. What does it mean, a woman rabbi? What does it mean, a woman can put on tefillin? What does it mean, women and men being together as a matter of fact? Today, this doesn't cause any problems. In all countries of the world, and even in Israel itself, Reform Judaism or modern Judaism is developing by leaps and bounds, and no one dares to say whether it's right or wrong. It simply exists as a fact and continues to exist, because we have different rules and norms for living now. We no longer divide people into ours and theirs. Everyone has freedom of speech and religion, but not in the world we're studying. That world didn't have any freedoms at all. There were no human rights protections there, and no freedom of religion. Everything there was divided into black and white. The synagogue clearly defined who was one of us and who was the enemy. And that's it. There were no third ways, no middle ground, nothing else existed. There was no Hasidism yet, and none of the other Jewish movements that would emerge in later centuries. But at that time, at that moment, it was a struggle for survival. That's why many Jewish groups, as well as those who were close to the path of Israel, were left out. And in the end, they were not accepted by the synagogue. And they were also not accepted by the church because they were very Jewish. And so, they ended up caught in the middle between these two growing worlds. The Roman Empire took control of Christianity and declared itself the successor of the Apostle Peter, adopting the path of development specifically of Alexandrian Orthodoxy, which essentially shaped its entire subsequent path of self-expression, and all the following paths, all the subsequent historical nuances, stemmed precisely from this. And everyone else who didn't fit into this orthodoxy was left out. We have a question. Why wasn't the text of the Didache included in the New Testament? That's a very interesting question. Why, after all, the text of the Didache could have been included in the New Testament. It could have become part of the canon, for example. But why didn't it become part of the canon, and no one talks about it, and no one teaches about it? Because the Didache is too much of a Jewish book. It deals with ordinary concepts of daily life, ethics, and morality. It simply lays out questions of everyday life. Not so much questions of theology, doctrine, or the concept of how to believe in what the divine is. Those questions were already clear to those people. No one had any doubts about who God was or who his Son, the Messiah, was. That was understood. It didn't require any particular reasoning until the Church Fathers in the 4th century, or even earlier in the 2nd or 3rd, started to focus on it closely, and until the wonderful, marvelous Greek philosophy with its brilliant conclusions got involved. And that's why we ended up where we are now. The Didache couldn't be included in the New Testament canon because it would have been an instruction manual that, in itself, contradicts the teachings of the early church fathers. You see what I mean? The idea, for example, that Jesus is the Messiah who is a servant. So where, then, are all our dogmas about God as man or man as God? Where, then, is our endless foundation for these things? It's not in the Didache, because at that time people didn't know anything about it. All these formulations were created much later. So, tomorrow we'll wrap up this week together. We'll talk about the synagogue and the church. All week we've been discussing the different paths of this development. Tomorrow we'll sum it all up. Next week, I've decided to continue this topic. And we'll talk about Christianity in Rome, because we're going to go even further. We'll discuss how the Romans in general viewed Christians. We'll talk about the persecutions during Nero's time. We'll talk about who was considered a martyr. And were these people who suffered and were tortured Christians as we imagine them today? Or were they Judeo-Christians, whom we don't really know? We'll discuss why Christians rejected paganism, but, for example, did not reject the Torah. All right, my friends, I wish you all blessings. Shalom to everyone.